You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. As I always say, it is a real joy, and I mean it, to be able to spend this time with you, especially in that we're examining the life of Jesus as presented in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. I include Acts because it's volume 2 of Luke. It's a terrific study of Jesus that is presented there in the New Testament, and I just love to spend time talking about the story. So we're in Matthew 5.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partnered champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and President Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
Most people these days, even those who are very pro-Jesus, don't get really comfortable when they read what Jesus says next in the Sermon on the Mount about divorce and remarriage. And I can understand it. So let's read what he says, and then let's kind of walk our way through it and see what we can gain from spending a little time with his very profound words. Verse 31 of chapter 5 of Matthew. It's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you've heard it was said to the people long ago. Well, in fact, let's stop there. I'll move on later with that other part. You know, here in the 21st century, we live in an era of disposable relationships. Nearly 1 in 2 marriages ends in divorce. I think it's almost 50-50. And we accept it, even though it's often painful. Increasingly, young couples are choosing cohabitation without the legal trappings of marriage, simply as a way of avoiding red tape when the inevitable breakup occurs, And some marriage contracts now have clauses in them about how property will be divided and or children when that moment comes. Because the breakup will occur. It's just a given. That's how we see it. That's how we understand it in our culture today. Very few expect to marry for life. I remember one time I was getting a little treatment and in a hospital, just a brief moment there over some minor thing. And the nurse is interviewing me a bit about my medical history, which is kind of dull because I've not had any operation. What? You've had no operations? No. I'm afflicted with good health, I said. I just thank my parents. Great gene pool there. Anyway, she said, and so how long have you been married? And, this was a few years ago. I said, 50 years. 50 years? In my world, that's 5 marriages. And she wasn't joking. To meet someone who'd been married for 50 years was like a bolt out of the blue for her. And that was quite a few years ago. Very few expect to marry for life. It's just not expected. And so it's a bit of a jolt to read Jesus' prohibition of divorce. It seems harsh. But let's look at the context. And friends, context is so important when you're studying the scriptures. Context, context, context. What is the social context? What is the political context? What is the biblical context? How does this comment or this passage compare with another passage over here on the same subject and over there on the same subject? How does what we find here in the book of James relate to what we find over here in the book of Exodus? And that's what Paul means when he says to young Timothy, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman who needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Dividing? Context. 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 And then taking the time, and these days of the Evernet, the internet being everywhere, and also with artificial intelligence, whether that's good or bad, you can research anything. You need to know as much as you can when you're studying a passage about the political context, the social context. You need to know who the author was, who his audience was, what the occasion was for writing that, meaning what was the reason for writing this? What was the setting? What was the background of the writer? Like, for instance, when you're reading the Apostle Paul, it's really valuable to know that he was a PhD of the PhDs. He'd been trained his whole life to be a rabbi. He was a Pharisee. He was from Tarsus, from a university city, big university city with high intellectual quotient. From a wealthy family who were able to afford to send him and support him to Jerusalem to sit for years at the feet of, that's another way of saying being a student of, Gamaliel, one of the foremost prophets of the day, foremost rabbis of the day. When you know that Paul has this background, and on top of that, until he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, was predictably a religious zealot. I mean, he was happy to kill Christians, to throw them in prison, to break up families, because he was doing it in the name of God. That's how he saw it. That was a reflection of his training. It was also a reflection of his energy level and of his activism, all of which stood him in good stead on the other side of his conversion. The more you understand who Paul was, the more his words, which are sometimes so insightful and sometimes very cutting, are understandable. Oh yeah, well, I was reading about that issue, in this rabbi or that rabbi. I mean, it's interesting, in all the study I have to do, over 53 years now of preaching the gospel full time, I'm on a constant learning curve. Constantly. Like I never reached the point where I knew it all. In fact, what I'm discovering is the more I study the scripture, the less I know, because it's so vast. And its vastness is only made apparent to you after you've spent decades studying it. Context. So, let's look at what Jesus said about divorce in context, shall we? After that diatribe. Marriage as a social contract was under siege in Jesus' day. In many ways, this reflected a clash of cultures, Jewish culture, Roman culture, Greek culture. And in the Jewish context, there was the added conflict of the perennial liberal-conservative divide. So the liberal school, under the leadership of Rabbi Hillel, this was in Jesus' day, sided with the Greco-Roman view that marriage could be dissolved easily and for any reason. The conservative school, under Rabbi Shammai, was counterculture. It contended there was only one justifying cause for divorce, and that was adultery. Now, you have to remember context here, historical context, social context. It was a man's world at that time. The liberal view of Hillel, the convenience divorce of Greece and Rome, and the syntheses of these cultural norms all led to a man-sided approach. Shammai, although accused of legalism, sided with the women. Can you believe it? He was a women's libber back then. He didn't want to see women with no rights, especially when it came to the protection and nurture she deserved as a mother and a homemaker at that time. Her rights must be recognized and defended. And Moses and Jesus agreed with that view. A woman was not a throwaway. You just can't throw her away. Just divorce her for any reason. Indeed, the whole point of Moses providing what was called a certificate of divorce to a woman who was being divorced was to protect her from her former husband returning and forcing her back into marriage again, which he could do, because he could say, well, you're still my property. She could pull out this certificate of divorce, which had legal imprint, and say, no, I'm not. This proves it. And there was nothing he could do then. He could not force her back into his control. So the divorce certificate was her defense against being treated like property. It meant she had the legal right to say no to her former husband. She had other rights as well. In Exodus 22, Moses delineates the basic rights she had as either concubine or wife. The man was required to provide her, quote, with food, clothing, marital rights, which means sex. And the whole point of that was so she could have children, which would give her status and honor in the community. If these were not provided, she had the right to divorce him. Although, as history proved, it was a very, very difficult road. Okay. So what am I doing here, friends? I'm demonstrating what I was talking about earlier. I'm demonstrating the importance of understanding a passage of Scripture in its context. Okay? And there's much more that we'll discover in a moment when we take a break. But keep this in mind, friends. This is a current discussion, and we want to be as biblically focused as we can be.
With your help, while working for orphans and widows, want to give a bicycle to our volunteers in Africa. Volunteers walk hours along winding, dusty roads to visit people who are sick and dying. They bathe and clean them, bring them medicines and food, and lots of care and support. Would you like to ride a bicycle this Christmas? What a difference a bicycle would make. Instead of 6 hours to get there, they can get there in 2. This Christmas, we're asking you to wrap up a bicycle. Here's how. Donate through our website, by phone or by check.
In Matthew 19, verses 3 to 9, Matthew tells us that Jesus was tested, quote, tested by the Pharisees with this question, quote, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason, unquote? And that, of course, was something that sprang out of the liberal school of Hillel. Any and every reason. Now, context, okay? King Herod, who ruled during Jesus' life, there's historical context, had divorced his wife Herodias, and as I've already pointed out, there was a great polarity of thought within Judaism itself between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Divorce for any cause, divorce only for adultery. It's a man's game? No. Women's rights must be defended. Okay. Now, there were some ultra-religious men who lived out in the desert called the Essenes or the Essenes. They were celibates. That's how they solved any marital issue. Just don't marry. The Hillelites were liberals. A man could divorce his wife for burning his dinner. The Shammaites were ultra-conservative. No divorce except for adultery. If Jesus was rigid on this question, he would offend Herod and the school of Hillel. If he was lenient, he would fall out with the school of Shammai. So it was a test indeed. His answer took the wind out of everyone's sails. In essence, he says, marriage is God's creation. The two sexes are complementary. Indeed, the very first command he gave, the command it seems that everybody wants to fulfill these days in Genesis, go forth and multiply. But the sexes are complementary for the purposes of procreation and of companionship. We all need a companion. So the intent of marriage then is to leave the family in which one was raised. The scripture says, leave your father and mother and establish your own. Cleave to your wife. And so in the biblical view, the unit is not the individual, but the family. God is not only creator of the institution, but he's part of it. You must not break it up. This is Jesus' view. Okay, said his interlocutors. Okay, but Moses allowed divorce. Why else would he command that a certificate of divorce be given to the woman? Jesus responded by saying that Moses did not command it. He permitted or suffered it in the Greek. He suffered it, which means he didn't like it at all, but he allowed it. Why? Because the culture was hard, he says, for the hardness of your hearts. Then he warns them that divorce for any reason is not on the table. In fact, only sexual immorality is reason for divorce. And apart from that exception, a man is not free to remarry, and the same principle applies to a woman. Jesus says in Mark 10:12, if she takes the initiative and divorces her husband for any reason, implied, she too commits adultery if she remarries. The critical issue here is the protection of the woman in a man's world and the protection of the family. Anything that fractures the family is seen as evil. Divorce is a kind of self-imposed relational schizophrenia. God hates it. Prophet Malachi says in Malachi 2, verse 16. To appreciate God's hatred of divorce, you got to look at that Malachi passage, Malachi 2, 10 to 16. And I know this is a program with a kind of a casual approach to the story of Jesus. We're not given to academic analysis of the text, but it must be said that this passage is very difficult to interpret from the Hebrew, and I've been working on it again just this week in preparation for this program. Malachi 2, 10 to 16, you can read it for yourself. It leaves room for diverse opinions, for one thing. Malachi starts the argument by declaring that Israel has one God and a unique covenant. Israel will be his people, he will be their God. But they've become disloyal to their national family, to their spiritual family, and to their marriage partners. Disloyalty on every level. These grim realities are all evidenced by their idolatry, by their mixed marriages, by their adultery, and by their divorce. So in God's view, as Malachi presents it, there is continuity and spiritual unity implicit in covenant with God and covenant in marriage. Idolatry and adultery destroy covenant. God hates them, just as he hates the end result. So as Jesus sees it, the marriage covenant is inviolable. Because God is present in every wedding, divorcing your partner at a latter stage suggests the fracture extends to heaven itself. Now, this doesn't mean that divorce is the unpardonable sin. Today, as in Jesus' day, there are and there were all kinds of extenuating circumstances and all kinds of levels of hardness of heart. And the Bible tells us that God the Father pitieth his children in their distresses and provides for their healing. But what Jesus is doing here is declaring the ideal. When the real destroys the ideal, he'd be the first to say mercy trumps justice. But he wouldn't like it any more than Moses did. But a word to the wise: when you marry, keep the back door closed. Now, it's the concept of the broken covenant that intrigues me here. Recently, I did a fairly intensive study of covenant in the scripture, and I'm not going to bore you by giving an academic dissertation. But let me say this: covenant comes from a concept, a Hebrew concept, of being manacled. Manacled. It's like your wrist and God's wrist, and God doesn't have a wrist, of course, but you follow my meaning. Your wrist, your wife's wrist, your wrist, and your children's wrist are bound together, manacled, okay? And nothing must break that bond. Nothing. However, we have any number of stimuli out there, especially in our highly sexualized world, and we find ourselves sometimes so easily breaking covenant. And when one breaks covenant, that doesn't mean that one has broken it forever and one cannot be restored. By no means. However, the breaking of a covenant is a very serious thing. To the point where, in a biblical view, ultimately, the breaking of a covenant is like a death. Like a death. And sometimes as a pastor, I have had to deal with domestic situations where multiple deaths have occurred in terms of a husband's unfaithfulness to his long-suffering wife. He has no intention of changing his behavior. He sees her as chattel. In many cases, he abuses her physically, which, of course, God will not tolerate, nor will any pastor worth his salt. But from time to time, I've said to a woman in that situation, he has broken covenant with you. He has broken the bond. He has died. You have become a widow because of this relational fracture. And even as I say it, I hate to say it, because not only, have I learned from the scripture that God hates divorce, Jesus hates divorce, but I hate it too. Because I've seen the domino effect it has in the lives of my people as a pastor. At the same time, I will not see a victimized woman dying on the vine because her husband is dead to her. And so, on occasion, I have said the only option here is a divorce. I remember when I was pastoring in Jerusalem years ago, when an Israeli would come to the Lord, almost immediately, in many cases, especially if they were Orthodox in their Jewish faith, their family would begin not just divorce proceedings, but in some cases would have a funeral. Because as far as they were concerned, they'd broken covenant and they were dead. This is a serious subject. If you've been divorced and remarried, carry on. No one, including me, is going to condemn you. But understand something. Marriage is a serious covenant. Enter it with serious intent.
For over 20 years, WOW, working for orphans and widows, has been caring for vulnerable and at-risk women and children hard hit by the HIV and AIDS pandemic in Africa and India. WOW engages with local partner champions and church-based volunteers in the care of the desperately needy. Now, in recent months, we have expanded our reach to Ukraine. Over 8 million refugees have fled the ravages of that war-torn country, mostly women and children, including many orphans. Our partner in East Europe tells us of the busing of Ukrainian orphans through the night to safety. Churches have become refugee centers, opening their buildings to become safe havens in the rescue. And WOW has come alongside. We have begun supporting this rescue work, but there is so much more that we must provide to these heroic churches. They need funding to continue for hundreds of orphans yet to come. We may be only small players, but you can partner with us in the rescue of Ukrainian orphans. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
When Kathy and I married 53 years ago, as I speak now, I'd been well taught by my dad, and she by hers, about the seriousness of marriage. And when we said, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part, and made that covenantal statement, we meant it. And I'm so glad we did. Because life has a way of throwing curves at you. And there are times when it's covenant that keeps you from fracturing. And I would encourage you, friends, if you're considering marriage, understand it's the most significant decision you'll make, apart from the decision to follow the Lord. And it can produce great fruit and great joy. And don't be discouraged by the potential pitfalls. But remember this, the nurturing of that relationship over the years will be your covenant. Thanks for watching. See you next time.